Let us now try out basic authentication in Postman. Before that, I'll explain the scenario that we are going to try out to use basic authentication. So for that, I'll move to the Swagger UI for Bookstore API. And to understand basic authentication, we are going to try out adding a book to the user that we created. So if you remember, we had created a user using post request that we constructed, and now we are going to assign a book to that same user. So the API that we see here, post bookstore v1 books, is the API that will be used for that. So if we see, it asks for a user ID and a collection of ISBN, that is the ISBN of the book that we need to assign to the user. So let us now move to Postman and start with this. So let's move to the same tool that we had used in case of encoding and decoding when we studied about basic authentication. So before that, let us just copy the body that we'll be needing to create the request. So I copy it, and here we are in Postman. So I simply click on plus to create new request. Since this was a post request, let us select post and then move to body because we have already copied it. We'll be doing things similar to what we had done in post request. So I select raw, I select JSON since the body is in JSON format, and I just paste it over here. We'll have to change these values over here, but before that, let us first copy the URL and paste it. So since it is bookstore books, and we have the URL ready. Now the user ID is of the user that we had created when we studied our first post request. So I'll quickly open the post request that I had saved for create user. And if you remember, we had created a user test user 2020. Now after we received the response, I had saved the response in an example, which is why we have it over here, and I'll simply open it and copy the user ID. So this can be one of the application of save as example feature for the responses that we receive. Let me paste the user ID, and the ISBN can be of any book that we want to assign to this user. So I'll again open the API for getBooks API. Again, there's nothing new over here. We had already studied this in our first get request that we had created. And let me click on send, and we get the list of books available. So I'll copy the ISBN of first book, which is Git Pocket Guide, and paste it over here. Okay, and let us now click send. So it says that 401 unauthorized. So this is because this API expects some kind of authorization to be provided while accessing the API. So here we are going to apply the concept of basic authentication. Let's move to the authorization tab and see how we can go about this. In the authorization section, first we have to choose the type of authentication or authorization that we wish to apply for this request. Since in our case it is basic authentication, let us select basic authentication, and we see that the fields required for this basic authentication automatically appear on the right hand side. In our case it is username and password. So let us type in the username, that is test user 2020, and the password that we had, that is test password @2020, and we also have an option to show password in plain text. Okay, so there's something wrong here. I corrected it. So yes, now it's correct. And let us try on sending again. Yep, so now this time we get 201 created status, and the book is assigned to that user. So our request was successful, but it is important to understand how basic authentication was actually taken care by Postman. If you remember, in basic authentication, we send the username and password in base64 encoded format, while when we created this request, we did nothing of that sort. So how did this work? For that, let's move to the headers section. We see that in headers, there was a key added named authorization with the value basic and some encoded string. So this is the encoded string of our username and password, and Postman took care of adding this header automatically because we had selected the authorization type as basic authentication. So this is one of the advantages that Postman gives us, that we do not have to go through the headache of converting our username and password in base64 encoded format and attaching the keyword basic before it. But the Postman does that for us automatically. We can also confirm that the base64 encoded string that was sent in header is actually of the username and password that we had sent. So let me just copy the encoded string in the header and again go to the same utility that we had used online for encoding and decoding of base64. So this time I have selected the option to decode, and if I paste the base64 format over here and say decode, we get the username and password of our user, which is testuser2020 colon test password @ 2020, which is what we saw is the requirement of the basic authentication. Of course, there was also an option to directly put the header in the headers section with authorization key and the value of basic paste the base64 encoded string of the username colon password. But then you would have required to use another utility and then encode the string and then put it over here. But Postman took care of all that headache for us and made our life easier. So I hope that you can now use basic authentication in Postman and also understand how it works.